Ends the reading. Some people have a troubling relationship with bread these days. Fear of gluten, carbs, calories is partly to blame. An overabundance of food choices seems to be another reason. Today, as we focus on our scriptures about God and Jesus being bread for us, I think it's important to get some historical context about bread. Bread is a universal food. Every culture has their own version of bread, and some ancient cultures even relied solely on their nutrient-rich grains combined with water to sustain them. Bread making was a key moment in the history of human evolution because people were able to take flour and water and substantially increase the availability of food for people. Bread sustains us. My friend and colleague Alicia Martin is a masterful and committed bread maker. When she made challah bread recently, which is shaped as a braid, she learned that its shape is because it's meant to be shared. And those in our office are happy to receive the bread she makes. When she made sourdough bread, Alicia learned that the first big step is making your starter. The goo is made of water and flour, and it's to be nurtured and watched and kept from getting too large. Some of the goo has to be discarded and is often shared with other people so that they can build their own starter with its own unique characteristics. And even if you ignore the goo in your refrigerator for weeks, you can feed it again and it will forgive you and it will come back to life. During this last year and a half in our world, I have sometimes felt like that sourdough starter goo. I have felt spiritually hungry, depleted from too little contact from family and from friends, saddened by the crises and the grief all around us. And then, at those times when I turn back to God, sometimes I recall God as bread. And I feel more hopeful that we'll all get back to life again one day, just like the goo. So in our readings, we learned that one of the ways God comes to us is as bread. And as our Creator, God is instrumental in feeding us physically with food. God also spiritually nourishes us through coming in flesh and in blood in Jesus, connecting us intimately to God and the ways of love. One of the ways we participate in this physical and spiritual nourishment is when we receive the gift of communion together, as we will today. And when we really listen to ourselves, there's no doubt that we hunger for bread, both physically and spiritually. We need food throughout each day to live. What a gift it is to be enjoyed. And we also need the bread that is offered by God in order to have an abundant life, especially in the face of life's crises. So what does it look like to be fed by God? I like Jan Richardson's description. She says, on this difficult path of life, there will be help and rest at times. I can tell you that you will know the strange graces that come to our aid only on a road such as this, that fly to meet us bearing comfort and strength, that come alongside us for no other cause than to lean themselves toward our ear and with their curious insistence whisper our name. Beloved, beloved, beloved. Sometimes comfort and strength also come from breaking bread with other people. Eating at its best involves table spirituality, where both our physical and spiritual hungers are satiated. M.F.K. Fisher said that the need for food, love, and security are intertwined. She said there is communion of more than our bodies when bread is broken and wine is drunk. For me, what really feeds my soul is the relationships I form around tables. I had the privilege of being part of a small group of people who met every Sunday night for many years to nourish each other, body and spirit. We would share a potluck dinner together as we spoke from our hearts about our celebrations, our struggles, our sorrows. We supported one another through that listening, through humor, through trust, and through prayer. I haven't met with such a group for many years, but sometimes I get glimpses of it at gatherings around a table with great food, wine, and conversation. And each time I'm reminded that eating is so much more than a utilitarian pursuit to live. It's a sacrament where God is present and people are changed. In Exodus chapter 16, God's people crave food in the desert. They forgot the oppression under which they lived for hundreds of years and longed to go back where food was plentiful. They forgot God had just brought them out of that oppression with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Some of us may relate and know what it's like to be surrounded by an abundance of food while our spirits are oppressed in some way. Or maybe we can relate to wanting what was in our past while ignoring the abundance that is right before our eyes. God heard the complaints and cravings of the Israelites. God sent them meat and bread to sustain them. Quail covered the ground for them to eat, and bread came with the dew each morning. It was called bread from heaven and is commonly referred to as manna. Manna means, what is it? Which the Bible describes as being like coriander seed and white, and it tastes like wafers with honey. God fed them this manna for the 40 years that they wandered in the wilderness before entering their promised land. The people of God were invited to trust God and to only gather the amount of manna they need for each day. Neighbors were called upon to live together in trustful equity. Those who stored up extra bread out of anxiety and greed would find that their manna spoiled and melted. Like the Israelites, we long to know what's ahead so we can plan and prepare. It's difficult to live one day at a time, to live in the moment, trusting that God will supply what we need. But I keep having to learn that this one day, this one moment, is all we really have. It's all we can really hold on to. God only sent enough bread for everyone to have what they need for that day, with the exception of the Sabbath, where they got to gather more the day before so they could honor the sacred day of rest. So some may ask, where's the manna we need today? And I say, it's here. We're here. Perhaps the message to us is that no matter what desert or wilderness wherein God can bring us some sustenance and life. God hears us. God's presence is powerful. Deserts can be transformed into places of God's wondrous splendor. In our gospel reading from John today, we hear of another miraculous feeding story. We see that those thousands of people who were fed bread by Jesus when they were hungry naturally tried to make him their bread king. They wanted their physical need for bread to be met and seemed to overlook the deeper needs that Jesus was offering to meet in them. In response to their hounding him and trying to make him something less than he was, Jesus withdrew and spent time alone on a mountain to gather strength for the next encounter. In John 6, Jesus reminds his people that manna or multiplying loaves are almost nothing compared to God risking coming to us as a person of flesh and blood to give life to the world. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus said he is the one God sent. He is the bread that will meet the needs of our deepest hungers. We're beckoned to come to Jesus, believe in him, and receive the life he generously offers us. Jesus points out that those who ate manna in the wilderness eventually died. In contrast, Jesus said, he is the living bread, and that whoever eats his flesh and drinks his blood will never die? What? Scholars have debated endlessly as to the meaning of those words and their connection to communion. It's no wonder that many turned away from Jesus at this point in John's narrative, and some even began to plot to kill Jesus after these teachings. In the very beginning of John's gospel, Jesus is referred to as the Word made flesh. But it gets even more intimate in describing a relationship with Jesus in John 6. We're not only to follow Jesus as the Word of God, we are to consume him as the bread of life. He wants to become part of us, to shape us to his purpose, to live in all that we do. John is trying to describe to us what faith in the Word made flesh looks like. Seeing Jesus in signs is not the same as encountering or consuming the Christ that is the Word made flesh. It's not the same as knowing Christ as God. In John, Jesus is trying to connect our physical hunger back to our spiritual hunger. The two cannot be separated. What good are signs if you're physically hungry? What good is eating if you're spiritually wanting? Abundant life is possible when the flesh and the spirit are held together because they belong together. When the 5,000 plus people were fed by Jesus, perhaps they wanted him to become their bread king because they viewed the event from their flesh only. The feeding of bodies is important. It's vital, but John asks us to also listen to our deeper hungers, to see and believe Jesus as the one God sent, and to live fully in that reality. John's gospel takes it a step further and also says, one must eat Jesus not just stay in their head and listen to his teachings. To John, because the flesh and the spirit are united. They are united in the incarnation of God in Jesus. In other words, the gift of Jesus' teachings are just as important as the gift of food. Jesus says he himself is the food that gives life with a capital L, not the manna or the multiplied loaves. Some believe that John teaches that one of the key ways a believer partakes of this food is through eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood in communion or Eucharist. Whether you buy that interpretation or not, soon, when we have communion together, we can remember that we are a community formed from those who share in Jesus' presence and his generous feeding of us. The communion table is God's table, and God is the host, inviting us to allow our inseparable bodies and spirits to be fed and to be nourished. If God is bread we eat, what is this feeding for? And I think it has something to do with gathering strength and nourishment to be bread for other people. Encountering Christ involves feeding the world, both physically and spiritually. We're called to be signs of God's presence in the world. We're called to be sacrament to those around us. The community of God believes bread that is broken and shared has power for life that bread does not have when it's unbroken and unshared, or when it's guarded and hoarded. Just like the challah bread and goo of the sourdough starter is meant to be shared, so we as Christ's community share our goods like manna with equity and liberality. We're called to live in generosity to one another, but we need God's help to do this. Maybe that's why Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," to help us let go of anxious hoarding and to trust in God's provisions for each day. I believe we can also be bread for each other in this extended season of world pandemic by protecting those most vulnerable, children, those with underlying health issues, the elderly, etc. We can make sure to receive the tools that can end this nightmare by getting vaccinated, by wearing masks. We can care enough about our heroic and exhausted healthcare workers and become heroes ourselves by listening to the gifts God has given us through science. We can care more about people than politics. We grow as Christ's body by speaking the truth in love. Jesus is not the one who will save us from COVID-19 and all the variants with us now and those yet to come. He has given us this task, and God has given us the tools to do it. This moment in history is giving us a chance to be Christ to others, to sacrifice our freedoms and conveniences so that everyone can go back to a more abundant life sooner than later. This is what it may mean to be bread to one another today, as God is bread to us each and every day. Today, as we share in this communal meal with God as our host, may we come with a sense of gratitude and humility we can find strength from this meal as we feed upon the lasting gifts of abundant life that are offered us through Jesus Christ. Imagine love increasing in you as you eat this bread and drink this cup. Imagine yourself growing in those secret places that you keep tucked away so that love cannot be hoarded for yourself alone, but shared with others. Martin Luther reminds us that the two words we say in communion, "for you," sum up the whole gospel. This is Christ's body given for you. This is Christ's blood shed for you. Let us enter a time preparing for communion with our communion hymn.